This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to the final one of Women in Classics and Contemporary Women's Prose seminar, or Women Writing the Classics. We have one electronic participant. We are somewhat reduced, but still the valiant people have come all the way to the end. And I here am obviously Eddie Spettu, and I'm a senior lecturer in Latin at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm interested in the intersection between classics and modern critical thought, particularly feminist theory. And I will be drawing on my work on reception of classics and contemporary feminist theory in order to chair this.
I hope you do.
I will.
We'll test it.
The prospect of me voicing my dear spouse is very frightening, actually. Because if I say the wrong thing, I will be in serious trouble.
Richard will never know it.
On the record.
So
on YouTube.
she does apologise, but she was desperate to come along, but it just couldn't happen for various reasons of health. So what we have, the culmination of this series is Elizabeth Cook and Salley Vickers. We have Elizabeth's books at the back, one each, by the looks of it, and tapes. You're on tape.
Yes.
And Elizabeth has an academic past, apparently, from Essex and Leeds, and we've been discussing Achilles, but you've also edited Oxford authors on John Keats, major works, and wrote a libretto for an oratorio, The Passion of Jesus of Nazareth, which was broadcast on Radio 3, and your poetry collection, Bold, unless that's out there as well, isn't it? Was published by Walpole Press, and you're now working on your second fiction what looks set in Israel and 16th century England. Salley Vickers also taught at university and escaped to become a Jungian analyst. I think actually we could do several of those. Just to explore some of the contradictions and repressions that we have. Her first novel, Miss Garner's Angel, became an international bestseller, and even more important, was critically acclaimed. And we'll be discussing where three roads meet, a work inspired by the myth of Oedipus, and that was part of the Canon Gate Myth series. And you're also probably may or may not be talking about your forthcoming novel, Cousins. And with that, who goes first? You're going to go first.
I'm down to go
right.
first. Yes. Thank you very much. Effie,
You can call me Ruth as well. That's
oh, right.
The names I go by.
I wasn't quite sure how formal or informal this was going to be, so I have actually kind of prepared a little introduction, but forgive me if it does sound a bit formal, but it's quite short. And then I'm going to read a bit from Achilles, from two parts of it. So soon after I'd given up my job in academia, I had a rather ill-defined idea that I was going to use the freedom to write non-academically. I was given my first non-academic commission as a real writer. This is Lord Weidenfeld who had the idea that someone should retell the stories of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid as a single volume for a readership who felt they should know these stories but couldn't read Greek and Latin. So my task was to write an extended proposal for this colossal work and to produce some sample chapters, which was a really tasty commission. My own knowledge of Latin was limited, although I'd already embarked on a translation of Seneca's Thyestes with Lewis and Short on my table and consulted about twice a sentence. And my Greek was minimal. I did embark on a wonderful course of classical Greek at the City Lit with a marvellous woman called Elizabeth Teller, who some of you may know, a really great woman. And I was thrilled to discover the plasticity of Greek, the way a verb seems to be pulled out of a noun. I remember the first sentence we used in a book called Greek through reading, so it was like direct method teaching. It was to ploion play. Is that right? Those of you who speak Greek? The ship ships it is how I felt it was. So this verb being created from the noun was really exciting. And I actually think it's worth knowing a little of something. I don't believe you should only do what you can do very well. And my slight knowledge of Greek was a great help for me. It enabled me to have a parallel text on my desk and to work out which phrases of Greek were being translated by the English that I was noticing, and to make a stab at speaking it to myself. I mean, no one else would have liked to hear it, but I could make some noises which I felt were classical Greek. That commission never came to anything, though I did make my way through the great works and created a timeline for a fat book which was rather stolidly called The Founding of Rome. And the sample chapters that I wrote included the stories of Odysseus and Polyphemus, Odysseus and Circe, both of which stories I've been very familiar with since childhood, so I've been living with them really. And the account of Priam's visit to Achilles' compound in Book 24 of the Iliad. And it was in the course of writing that narrative that I first heard what I really knew was my voice as a writer. And I remember Jenny Joseph, the poet, saying somewhere that you're stuck with your voice as a writer, rather like you're stuck with your face. You can't do anything about it. And I think that's absolutely the case. One can work at one's writing and should work at it, but there's an element which is choiceless. And I could appreciate and enjoy what, to my mind, was the more rococo sequence of narratives that comprise the Odyssey. But it was the gravity and the sorrow and the utterly earth nature of the Iliad which really spoke to me in a breath that felt familiar to me. And I was particularly drawn to Achilles. Though he's in many ways quite monstrous, I was drawn to what I felt was his clean-heartedness, his absence of duplicity. In this, he's the opposite of Odysseus, and from Odysseus's lies, from his duplicity, spin many stories. I don't know if any of you have been watching London Spy, some of which are set in Senegal, but it really values the importance of lying, and where would the world be without lies, and where would stories be without Odysseus, the master liar. But I wanted to write Achilles' story, and for a long time I was stymied by the absence of a voice in which to do so. For some reason I felt I should attempt a first-person account, but at the same time I felt the absurdity of creating an Achilles, a man utterly devoid of self-consciousness or any avowed inner life, who can be bothered to tell his own story. That doesn't seem a possibility for Achilles. Eric Havelock, in his preface to Plato, writes of Achilles that he's a man to whom it has not occurred, to whom it cannot occur, that he has a personality apart from the pattern of his acts. I thought it was a really interesting description of Achilles, and I think that's what really drew me to him. It was not until I met the actor Greg Hicks that a way forward became possible. John Keats's schoolmaster, Charles Cowden Clarke, spoke of Keats's complete consanguinity with Greek mythology. And Greg, as an actor, might also, I think, be called consanguineous, if that's the right way of saying it, consanguineous, with ancient Greek and its world, ancient Greece and its world. He's played variously Orestes, Dionysus, Oedipus, Priam, and Agamemnon. On an impulse, soon after I met him, I showed him the Priam narrative I'd already written. Greg asked if we could make a recording of it. He wanted to speak it. And this was what released the rest of the story, the experience of it being voiced and embodied. Over the next couple of years, I would write a section of Achilles and Greg would speak it. Together we worked on it as a piece to be performed, not acted, but spoken. the gesture being in the voice and the body of the speaker, not in any acted illustration. And I think this was also informed in my mind by the wonderful experience of witnessing Christopher Logue and Alan Howard at the Almeida speaking war music. And it was like being in on the beginning of theatre. You just saw the words rise up before you. There was no set, there was no acting, there was speaking. It was marvellous and thrilling. And I think Christopher Logue was also consanguineous with that world. And it's great that the complete war music has just been published as well. So what was to become the first part of Achilles was performed in 2000 at the Edinburgh Festival. But the second and third parts of the book have so far not been performed. They haven't had a performance life, and I think that's because Achilles himself is essentially performative. He is what he does, and the narratives that follow the moment of his death don't ask for performance in quite the same way. And this is maybe something we could talk about later. My love for Achilles had some confirmation in the discovery that Keats had loved him too. Surprisingly, perhaps, for Keats was a small man and very conscious of that fact, Keats identified with Achilles. I was moved by this identification, as I'm moved by the fact that however diverse and unlike our experience of life may be, we human animals have a common anatomy, unchanged for millennia, and a common mortality. Continuities, moments of contact, move and excite me. And for this reason, I prefer a written letter, which is handled by its author and numerous intermediaries, as well as by the recipient. I prefer that to email or texting. But even those continuities that don't involve physical contact have the strength of a shared morphology, our human morphology, the morphology of our anatomy. The voicing of the same words by different sets of vocal apparatus, breathing the air of different atmospheres, creates a connecting cable that stretches through time, a cable that does not annul difference or eradicate strangeness, but which does allow a sense of contact, like that provided by Keats's Nightingale, whose song found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. That preposition, through, is so important. The common song brings with it a sense of connection and lessens the sense of the alien. Individual nightingales die, but the song continues to be sung. I know this sounds like I'm making a pitch for eternal verities, which is a bit simplistic, but I think I'm really only suggesting something more modest, something which is simply connection. There's always change, always deviation and misprision in repetition. Misunderstandings, mishearings, as in Chinese whispers, warp the material and change its nature. And I don't think this is to be regretted. And just as an extra thing to say, I think I should mention that it was only after I'd finished writing Achilles that I discovered that his name means the one who mourns, or he stands for the people who mourn. And it's probably no accident that I wrote it at a time of intense grief after a sequence of very terrible bereavements. So that nature of Achilles as the one who mourns really, really spoke to me. How are we doing for time? I'd like to read now. I'll read the section about his conception because it's quite fun. And if it won't take up too much time, I might just read the very beginning of Keats. But I'll take my glasses off because I don't think I need it. I might stand up, actually, it seems. But first, a quickening. A mortal gets to do what the king of the gods is afraid of. How do you mate with Thetis, the sea nymph that the gods desire? The main thing, said Chiron, is not to let go. He too would like to pin her under his hooves. what would it be like? She will do everything she can to throw you. Buck, kick, bite, dissolve, shrink and grow thorns. You like them lively. This one is flame of life itself. If you want her, and you must, Zeus requires it, you have to hold fast, even to flame. You'll be burnt, and it will be worth it. Peleus is a patient man. He can spend 3 days listening to petitions, hearing each man have his say, judging the merits of each case without any sign of irritation or weariness. Each man who comes to him feels he's the first, that this beautiful, vigorous king wants to be nowhere else on earth but here, seated and attentive. He is patient in hunting too. Even as a boy, before he had strength, just the courage that builds it, he was able to wait. He knew that the best meat is the meat of an animal who has died without fear. Fear poisons meat, clogs the fibres. The hunter who puts fear in his prey will end up feeding on it. So he stalks her. Thetis, the sea nymph, allocated to him by Zeus, who wanted her himself, but didn't dare to lay a godly finger on her because of what the son she bare him would do to him. No one has bothered to ask Thetis if this man they have chosen for her will do. No one has shown her one good reason why she should let some mortal enter her. So he stalks her. She on her own is perfectly happy, unpenetrated by man or God. The sea and the air make love to her daily, know each fold and whirl of her, every line of foot and hand, every cleft and dimple. She comes from the sea and is made of it, but separate in her woman's shape, she can enjoy it more, dive cleanly into it, ride on it, play. Sometimes she turns herself into a wheel and rolls round and round on herself in the water. Then she straightens out to move like an arrow down to the seabed, where she grazes the floor along with a flat-bellied fish. When she comes out, she lies slapped on a rock while the sun licks her dry. The last thing she wants is some man clambering all over her. So he stalks her. She has come to this place for 8 days now. A little bay shaped like a new moon, cradling the sea between the delicate horns of its headlands. The sand on the beach is shockingly white. If a crab moves across, denting the drift with heavy claw, its darkness can be seen from the cliffs above. You don't need eagle eyes to see like an eagle here. Everything is so sharpened and magnified. Beyond the beach, some rocks, vegetation, a cave, sandy floored, cool, its entrance screened by myrtle. A good lookout. Only Thetis does not look out. She sleeps confident that only birds and animals know this place. While she sleeps, Peleus watches her, the myrtle his screen too. She is lying on her back, left arm stretched up, face turned towards it, her right knee slightly bent. What would it take to take her? He watches her all afternoon. The sun, all stealth, slides in and lays itself along her like a sword. She does not wake and the sun moves on. Peleus waits and watches, getting to know the shape of her, the edges of bone and the warm furrows, the heft of her, as he'll lift her on his cock. Feet quiet, close as dust, all edges but one, soften. Now! So little violence required, just enough to clasp her waist with his 2 hands, tip her back into an arch, hold her steady while he scabbards himself fast. Now, his right arm scooped under her back, knee wedging, thighs apart, she wakes to the man covering her, darkening her like a tent, coming between her and the light. Her arched back held, she arches more and bucks. Her body now, one sentient muscle, a heart, an eel, a fish. He feels the charge of her bucking like a thunderbolt. It flings him breathless to the ground. On his back now, hold on. As he falls, he reaches out, pulls on whatever substance his fingers find. It burns him and his fingers stick. If he were to pull away, his skin would come away too, charred like fish skin stuck to hot stone. Has he become fish to meet her? But she is fire now, roped flame, a long exhalation of searing heat, tongue upon tongue of it, each twined on itself, an avid, wildly flickering spiral. Howling with pain, he opens his throat and drinks in the flame. He'll be her scabbard, her sheath, her cup. No lover entered him so thoroughly, but she's not yet lover. He tries to hold on, to cleave to the flame that calls him, to move in closer, tighter. Not rope, but thread now. A fine fuse. Close now. Move with it. Let it tune you. Notice how it gets sharper as it gets finer. That should help you stay with it. Whatever you do, hold on. Keep it in view. But Peleus, caught by this flame, is dissolving. The rest of him is falling away. What is there in him that can follow? There is nothing of him to hold on with. Not fire now, but water. Does she think to elude him? She cools him, restores him to his edge, rinses his scalded, crazy flesh so it feels clear again. But as she streams off him, she starts to flee as water into the sand. Don't leave me! He sprawls across the ground, crushing himself into it. He takes up damp sand in fistfuls and plasters it across his chest. She'll not get away. He'll have her. He'll find her, whatever form she takes to. Even a lion's? Even a lion's. A lion now, she straddles him, would maul him between her huge paws, but he wraps himself round her, legs and arms clasping her trunk as she tries at this awkward angle to take his head into the cave of her mouth. She can't reach, and his wrap around her tightens. The lion fetus finds herself squeezed almost beyond bearing. Held now, she wants not so much to escape as to fight. Being squeezed, she lets herself go beyond the point where breath is lost, where lion expires, brings herself smaller, tighter, so she's now one lithe tube. A snake. So narrow, she could slip away if she chose. She's coiled herself around him, and now it is he who is near to expiring for want of breath. For a moment he panics. He is near to losing all the benefit of Chiron's wisdom, about to go against the will of Zeus and Juno and let go. Only he can't. She has him so fast in her grip. Now her snake tongue darts into his mouth, and its sharpness is so sweet to him, he wants to hold it there. Practiced on the filament of fire, he concentrates the whole of his being on drawing that sweet sting out of her. So they ride for a while. She fast around his body, covering him with her coils. He fast around the fine pulse of her tongue, intent on extracting its bag of nectar. He feels it will happen soon. She is gathering herself. The tongue is withdrawn. He is still held fast, but the dryness of snakeskin has gone, replaced by flesh which is softer, wetter, more enveloping. 10 pulsing arms are lapping him, and on their sides, on their undersides, are a great many mouths which adhere to him. Tiny, searching mouths suckling on him, rubbing its flesh against the bony ridge of their toothless gums. There is no surface of his body that she, this cuttlefish, does not contact, and which he in turn does not long to have drawn up and used by her. He's very near to losing himself, and if he does so, he'll lose her, though just now he doesn't have a mind to care. Now she's stopped escaping him. She needs him to find her. She cannot feel beyond the next need, which is that the nub, the palate of each tiny mouth be met by him, pursued right into the tight star which burns at its centre. He has no choice. The labyrinth now has no false corridors. He can only travel to the centre. Hit, met. The stars dissolve. He's covered in sticky black ink. Thetis, a woman under him. He draws himself up for a moment to look on his new wife with tenderness. Then he turns her over, enters her again, and empties himself of all the forms she has ever been. Neither of them wake until the sun has removed itself from the beach. Achilles is the 7th. 6 times Thetis has taken a wet new infant up by the heels and dumped it, umbilicus trailing, in the Styx, where she'd let it go. Immortality, she said, I'm burning away their mortal parts in the fire of this river. You're drowning my sons, he said. They're living on Olympus, she said. Not with me, they're not. The next time they made love, he became an eagle. He leapt. And in the after-sleep he dreamed of holding his son in his beak and flying him free of scalding waters. When the 7th sun comes, she begins again on the same rigmarole, but she lingers over it more, holding him by the left ankle as she turns him in the fiery waters, basting him on every side. The burning baby yells with all the force of unimpeded lungs. Peleus comes running, that sound has hooked into his bowels, and wrenches the child from her grasp. Just a little patch of flesh unburnt, the area held between pincers of thumb and forefinger. For weeks, using all the skill that Chiron has given him, he tends the poor burnt flesh of his child, till Achilles is as mortal as he. And I think I should stop there and not read any more.
No. I haven't prepared anything. I'm the last stages of completing my latest novel, and it's a very long time since I wrote this, Where Three Roads Meet, and I've never read it because I never read my own books. And so I have to dig deep in my memory to talk about it. But I'll say how I came to write this particular one of my books. I mean, I was invited to do so by Canongate, who had invited a number of contemporary writers to take a myth of their choice and do whatever they wanted to do with it. And I said, okay, I'll do it as long as it can be the myth of Oedipus. Now, I, in my first life, adult life, professional life, I was a university teacher of literature. But when I had my children, I moved into adult education, and I taught a number of adult evening classes. And by far the most popular were the classes I taught on ancient literature, partly because they were the classes probably I enjoyed teaching most. When I subsequently trained as, I mean, the correct term is an analytical psychologist for Jungians, but forget that for the moment. We all call ourselves psychoanalysts. Part of the training is the study also of the other great psychological theorists, Arthur and particularly Freud, because Freud is the kind of founding father of all psychoanalytic work. And part of the training, obviously, is the study of Freud's theories of sexuality. And as everybody here knows, Freud's principal theory of sexuality is founded on the Oedipus myth. And I knew this before. I knew this before I started training. And it seemed to me that he'd got it terribly wrong. I mean, he was actually a great classicist, and a great art historian, and fascinated by antiquity. But he couldn't resist imposing his own, the bees in his own bonnet on this remarkable myth, which I think he's absolutely right to have responded to. So I decided to take the myth, and I'll just read a bit of Freud with which I preface the book. It's from the Interpretation of Dreams, or Interpreting Dreams, as it's more correctly translated. So, yeah, I'll just read the whole bit. So this is Freud, this is not me. Oedipus, the son of Laius, king of Thebes, and Jocasta, is exposed as an infant because an oracle has informed the father that his as yet unborn son would be his murderer. He is rescued and grows up as the son of a king at a foreign court, until, unsure of his origins, he consults the oracle himself, and is advised to avoid going home, since he is destined to become the murderer of his father and husband to his mother. On the way from what he thinks of as home, he encounters King Laius and kills him in a fight that erupts swiftly. He then approaches Thebes, where he solves the riddle posed by the Sphinx barring the way. The grateful Thebans express their thanks by making him king and giving him Jocasta's hand in marriage. He rules for many years in peace and honour, and together with the woman he does not know to be his mother, has 2 sons and 2 daughters, until a plague breaks out, occasioning a fresh consultation of the oracle, this time by the Thebans. Now this is Freud's comment. The plot of the play consists quite simply, Freud put it, of the gradual intensifying and elaborately delayed exposure, not unlike the task of psychoanalysis, of the fact that Oedipus is himself the murderer of Laius, as well as the son of the murdered man and of Jocasta. Shattered by his unwittingly performed atrocity, Oedipus blinds himself and abandons his homeland. The words of the oracle are fulfilled. If King Oedipus is no less unsettling for modern man than it was for contemporary Greeks, the answer can presumably only be that the effect of the Greek tragedy does not rest on the contrast between fate and human will. It must be sought in the special nature of the material used to demonstrate that contrast. The only reason why his fate grips us is because it might also have been our own. Because prior to our birth, the oracle uttered the same curse over us as over him. It was given to us all, possibly unusual for it to have any qualification, to direct our first sexual stirring at our mother, our first hatred and violent wish at our father. Our dreams persuade us of that. King Oedipus, who struck his father Laius dead and married his mother Jocasta, is simply, again, the wish fulfillment of our childhood years. As the playwright in the course of his investigation brings to light Oedipus's guilt, he forces us to acknowledge our inner life, in which the same impulses, albeit suppressed, are still present. Like Oedipus, we live in ignorance of the wishes so offensive to morality with which nature has burdened us, and following the unveiling of which, we should no doubt all rather look away from the scenes of our childhood. Now, it seemed to me, there are 1 or 2 other surviving references to the Oedipus myth, but our principal one are the 3 Theban plays, which were not, as you all know, actually part of a coherent trilogy that have been put together subsequently in modern times. But the 3 Sophoclean plays which tell the story of the Oedipus myth, it seems to me that Freud's interpretation of that story is wildly out for all kinds of reasons. And the very first thought I had about this was, well, all of this would never have come about were it not for the fact that the parents seek to murder this child. It seemed to me their anxiety to rid themselves of the child they had born was the first thing that Freud was planning to look at. So that was the sort of axis around which I wanted to explore this myth. And because I myself had rather wanted to challenge Freud, and because pretty much in all my books, well, certainly to date by the time I wrote this book, have taken 2 timelines and put them together, I decided to challenge Freud in his interpretation of this myth during the dying years which he spends in England, when he comes to England escaping from the Nazis. Actually, to say escaping from the Nazis isn't quite true. He was persuaded to leave Vienna by his friends who were fearful that he would, in time himself, be put to death by the Nazis. He was actually rather reluctant to go. And in writing the book, I did become rather fond of Freud, while at the same time developing a theory that he was completely bonkers in his interpretation of this. So I had the dying Freud. I say dying because he was suffering from a very painful form of cancer of the mouth. In his years in Hampstead, in Maresfield Gardens, visited by Tiresias, who is one of the principal players in the Oedipus myth. And my idea was that he would act as a kind of dream figure. So he only ever appears to Freud when Freud is on his own. He only ever appears to Freud when he's in a period of, he's in that sort of hinterland between being very conscious and rather unconscious. On one occasion, he appears to Freud when he's been in hospital, and those were the only occasions when Freud allowed himself to take any form of painkiller, which is in itself rather remarkable. So I took the unconscious of one of the greatest exponents of the unconscious, Freud, and conjured up a figure out of this myth that he had incorporated in what it seemed to me was his rational rather than his unconscious mind. So that was the sort of principle around which I was retelling the story. I'm going to read a bit, which is Tiresias. I developed the story of Tiresias, who's a very interesting character. Tiresias, who has lived as both man and woman, and has the gift of second sight. And I developed the idea of him experiencing his own apprenticeship by going to work at the Delphic Oracle. So the whole book, by the way, is entirely a conversation between the two. So there is no explanation other than this ongoing dialogue between Tiresias and Freud. So this is Tiresias. You visited the sanctuary at Delphi. Freud now. Regrettably, I never made it further than Athens and the Acropolis. You know what impressed me most? That it existed. I stood on the Acropolis side by side with my brother. My young brother and I always took a small annual trip together, with my little goddess's great temple at my back. And I looked out across Mount Pendeli, bathed in that violet light, which always appears older than our northern light. And the thought that sprang to mind was, so it is real after all. A displacement, of course, of the child's belief that I would never live to see Athena's city with my own eyes. The mind plays tricks. You probably know that one of Freud's most treasured artifacts was a small statue of Athena. And when he left Vienna, the one thing, he had a lot of his relics packed up and sent after him, but he wasn't confident that they would ever get to England because he was fearful the Nazis would intercept them, and they did try to. But the only one he took personally himself was his little statue of Athena. So this is Tiresias. No doubt about that. But I wonder if you are right. Whenever I returned to Delphi, I had the same thought. This is real. Maybe such places are more real than what is commonly taken for real. Ah, then, but what is real, my friend? A very thorny question. Nothing on earth is more real to me than Delphi. In all weathers, in all lights, in all minds, it is a place of peculiar power, of natural grace, of astonishing brilliance and darkness, a fearsome yet remediate place, of measureless quiet and fathomless awe. Delphi's impress never leaves me. The deep shadowed dells, the steep gorges which refract far-shooting Apollo's light, and the ravines where his ravens nest and cry, and a body might fall and perish, and the bones never be found. The fierce springs which run ice-cold under the earth, and emerge as fountains, sharp as crystal, the pale mornings, misty as narcissi under snow, for the snow can lie heavy on the heights well into spring, the remorseless summer noons, when the sun carves shadows stern as stone and marble, and the only balm is the smell of wild thyme, perfusing the still air. The indigo twilight, hymned by the high-voiced bats, and the star-fretted nights, made mournful by the plaintive owls, and always below, in all seasons, the old green plain of Pleistos, whose river runs silver to the curving bay, where the sailors in the Cretan ship were steered by the gleaming-skinned, dolphin-shaped Apollo to be his first priests. The dusky-leaved laurels, the sky-piercing cypresses, the gummy pines, the ancient olive groves, shredding and reweaving the light, and the perpetual chirr of the cicadas and droning bees, criss-crossing the song of hidden birds. It haunts my mind always. You fill me with regret that I shall never see it with my own eyes. It is a sight for sore eyes, and ears more so still. It is a sight for sore eyes and ears, more so still for sore minds. But at any rate, I needn't explain to a man of your learning, Doctor, that the point of Delphi was Apollo's oracle, chief among all oracles. Many have called it the earth's womb, and the omphalos, the sacred stone which lay at the sanctuary centre, marked the earth's navel, decreed so when Zeus set 2 eagles to fly in opposite directions to meet and designate the very centre of the earth. I seem to recollect the story. You may have heard too that within Apollo's temple, above the area where the snakish offspring of the earth goddess Gaia once had lain, a tall bronze tripod stood. On this was seated an elderly celibate, the Pythia, the sole priestess of Apollo, who acted as his mouthpiece, and whom petitioners came to consult. The ancient creature's den lay over a chasm in the earth, which exuded vaporous fumes inducing intoxication. The Pythia, chewing bay leaves sacred to Apollo, imbibed these fumes, and in a delirious frenzy delivered up the god's response in a weird, wordless chant. An officiating priest then translated the divine responses into poetry, delivering the written verdict to the questioner. I believe I've read something to that effect. You would have done. Someone cooks up a story and they all repeat it. The reality wasn't quite like that. It never is it? Not as we wish it to be, that's certain. I can only speak from my own experience, but in my day, the Pythias started young. It was only as time went on that the older women were chosen. My hunch is that the young girls acted up, and the priests couldn't handle them. Got hysterical. Another term I hear you've made your reputation with. I've certainly accounted for a few hysterics in my time, and the tripod the priestess sat on was nothing lofty. It was based on a simple cooking tripod. The English have a saying as right as a trivet, because 3 legs are stable, like your tripod. Exactly. It was designed for placing over the hearth, quite homely. You know, in German, homely is the opposite of uncanny. In many ways, Doctor, Delphi was uncannily holy. In any case, it was home to me. I never saw a Pythia chew leaves. Lord knows where that notion came from. The Holy of Holies, where she sat to pronounce, lay below the level of the rest of the temple. And in the floor, which was left earthen, an ancient bay tree grew. The Pythia, when she pronounced, cut a branch from this shrub, and at the god's approach the leaves trembled, which was no great trouble to fudge if need be. with a discreet shake of the hand. As for her so-called delirium, it was ecstasy, not frenzy. She was out of herself, not out of her mind, though I grant you the sounds that came from her were unworldly. And you had some hand in all this. Much of a priest's work was very prosaic. Even in my day, Delphi was a complex financial enterprise. The cost of a consultation was considerable. On top of various civic contributions, each individual petitioner was made to pay a high price. First for the cake burned on the sacred fire, then again for the preparatory sacrifices, a death for the deathless ones, of which the lion's share went to the priests. Only after these procedures was a petitioner permitted into the Holy of Holies, and the god could safely be approached. But you charge fees yourself. An entirely different matter. Psychoanalysis is an exact science, evolving close and systematic observation of the complexities of the human psyche, not a series of superstitious rituals designed to hoodwink the credulous. Whatever you say, Dr. Freud. I was going to add that many priests were corrupt, and with the right bribes, answers could always be fixed, which one could hardly bribe an analyst. What could an analyst possibly do or say that would be different if you slipped him a few notes on the side? The comparison was idle, Doctor. Let us say there are parallels. As with your profession, to become a priest of Delphi was to acquire enormous power. Many of the holy ones made their pensions out of bribes they received to put a question on the list. As for the high priests, they could rake in huge benefits through strategic bending of the Pythic utterances. Most verdicts, when you analyse them, could be swung either way. But, if I may say so without giving further offence, ambiguity is your bread and butter too. My aim is to disinter and unravel the ambiguous and bring it into the light of reason. The ambiguity of religious pronouncement merely encourages a mystification designed to bolster the authority of those who made the pronouncements. No need to get on your high horse, Dr. Freud. Even you will grant, I hope, that not all men, even priests, are corrupt, and not all verdicts twisted. And there were those who, for whatever reason, a pride in their work or a passionate conviction, believed that just as the moon reflects the sun's light, so Phoebus Apollo himself spoke through the Pythia, and those few translated to the best of their ability the truth of her cryptic sounds. Truth? That's a very dark horse. But there are those, Doctor, who ride dark horses, and who may see truth from a perspective other than that of those whose feet stick fast in the mud of reason. In my view, our best hope of survival is that reason would establish a dictatorship finally over the human psyche. Dictatorship, Dr. Freud? I see. Might not your little corporal agree with you there? Setting the fallible mortals aside, there are also places, thin places, where the membrane of the earth is stretched, and the immortal forces may more strongly be felt. The immortal forces, my good fellow, are a perennial fiction, a primitive defense against reality, or reality's original. Even as a beardless boy, I stood more than once in the holy precinct and felt a draught of peculiar freshness about my face and a strange sweetness in my nose, which was something more than the familiar scent of myrrh and bay from the ritual fire. And whatever your sceptical mind might make of it now, Dr. Freud, I tell you this was the odour of sanctity, and all-seeing Apollo was present. My dear man, that, I must tell you, is an example of temporary psychotic inflation, common enough among the susceptible, what Jung would call sympathetic magic, based on the known power of folk superstition. Think what you like, Dr. Freud. I assure you I shall, but don't go away with the impression that Phoebus Apollo was a namby-pamby, airy-fairy figure. Believe me, the training for his priesthood was a punishing, often brutal regime. We were dealt short rations, made to rise often in freezing conditions before dawn, bitten by lice and fleas, the more so if our skin was fair, as mine was, and worked till we dropped, learning until it became second nature to translate free speech into poetic hexameters. We were beaten for inattention, and often for less respectable reasons. The older priests were hard taskmasters, and some were sadists, and more besides. I was a pretty boy, and my mother's colouring marked me out as unusual. I learned soon that I could attain special favours by offering favours of my own, and believe me, I did so to protect my skin. There has grown a rumour that I spent 7 years as a woman. Well, in a manner of speaking, I did. Make what you like of that. I think I'll stop there.